In the previous video in this series, I was looking at repairing the tape drive and the tapes themselves for an HP9845B vintage computer. This is one of the old tapes that I have, and in this video I'm just going to go through the process in a bit more detail for trying to recover these tapes. I've had a bit of success so far with the tapes I have here, but it's a bit hit and miss. Some work a lot better than others, but I'm just going to go through the process that I take, and it does seem to work about 80% of the time. So I am recovering quite a lot of information off these tapes, and these are old tapes. They haven't been used for decades, and normally that's a recipe for disaster with these tapes if you just try and put them in the machine. So haven't tried to read this tape. This particular one just says games on it. I'm not really sure exactly what's on these tapes. But I haven't tried to turn this. I'm not going to put it into the machine at this point. That would destroy it. And there's a few issues with these that I mentioned in the previous video. The tape becomes sticky. It sticks to the drive belt. The drive belt themselves tend to fail, and it kind of either takes the magnetic media off the tape, and you end up with just a clear piece of tape that has no information on it, or the tape will stick to the drive belt and get pulled around the entire cassette, and it destroys the tape that way. And for the most part, as I say, you can get some fairly good results by just going through a fairly simple process. Also, I've been experimenting with various tape types. So in general, I've been using the DC2000s, having some good success with these. Very few errors once you've shortened them in particular and taken a lot of the tape off. Because the tape's quite heavy, and especially with it being a wider tape, and this machine spins the tape quite at quite high speed, when the DC2000 has the full length of tape on it, there's a lot of tape. The tape would normally extend almost right across to the second reel, but that means that the radius of gyration of the tape itself is quite large, and so any out of balance forces, the acceleration and deceleration, etc., are hampered because of the weight of the tape itself. And as you shorten the tape, it starts coming towards you, because as you take tape off, of course, you're reducing not just the weight of the tape, but you're taking it off the outside of the reel. You're making the diameter of the spool tape effectively smaller. And you do notice this. It's quite dramatic when you put these modified tapes into the drives. They are much quieter than the original tapes before you modify them, and also they tend to work better. Now, the magnetic media is actually on the back of the tape, so the side that faces the read-write head is the plain side. The magnetic media is actually on the other side, so it doesn't rub off on the read-write head. And that means that what I was looking at was other types of tape, and one tape that I've been testing quite extensively is the DC2120. And this is a very similar tape. It's obviously exactly the same cartridge design, same housing. The main difference is, whereas the DC2000 is a 205-foot tape, the 2120 is a 307-foot tape, so it's much longer, but of course the tape has to fit in the same size reel space. So the tape is correspondingly thinner. It's about 30% thinner than the tape used on the DC2000. And because the magnetic media is on the back of the tape, that's furthest from the read-write head, the thinner tape seems to help, and I've had much more success with the 2120s, and so far in a great deal of testing I haven't had a single read-write error with the 2120s, whereas I get the occasional error with the 2000s. They are recoverable for the most part, and they're fairly few and far between, but as I say, with the 2120s I haven't had any issues at all. You'll also notice, looking at this, if we compare them side by side, these are both modified with the same length of tape, so these both have 140 feet of tape. But notice on the 2000 the diameter of the tape is much greater than on the 2120, and again, not only is the tape lighter, but it's thinner, and so the radius of gyration is even smaller with the 2120, and these tapes are almost silent when you put them in the drive, and I think that's part of the reason that they are also more reliable. Less vibration, less movement of the tape, and the thinner tape all seem to work together to help. So the 2120 is definitely a tape worth trying. I have also been modifying a lot of the older tapes that I have where the tape itself had completely failed. Been putting in the Type 2 tape media, and that seems to work very well. It's quite variable. You do need to find one that works with the resistor value that you've put into your tape drive, and once you find one that works, it works quite well. So now on to trying to recover the tape. This is a tape I've just taken out of the box. I haven't tried to read this, I haven't tried to rotate it. If you try and rotate it, you will most likely tear the magnetic media off the tape backing, and the drive belt will almost certainly need changing anyway. I never run them with the original drive belts in. But step one is to bake them. Over the years, the magnetic media, the carrier material, tends to absorb a bit of moisture, gets a bit tacky, and it sticks the reel together. And when you combine that with the fact that you've had this drive belt pressing quite hard on the reels and pressing all the tape together, which is quite tightly wound on these anyway, the tape tends to stick together. And in fact, if you take the cover off this and try rotating one of these, you'll see that the tape tends to stick to itself and get pulled around, and again that will try and destroy the tape if you just try and read this in the machine. So step one is I don't try and turn them, I don't try and rotate them, I don't do anything at all except bake them. So I put them onto a little jig that I've made here, power this up, and what this is, it's just an aluminium block with a power device on it, a bias resistor, and it slowly heats the block up. Initially it's fairly slow, up to 55 degrees centigrade. In fact, I've got this set to 54, and that seems to work quite well. You don't want to go too high because that can cause the magnetic media in adjacent layers to be kind of printed through, so if you're not careful you can end up corrupting the data that's on them if you get them too hot. So I found that somewhere between 50 and 55 seems to work quite well. This will need to be left on here now for probably a good 12 hours. I normally leave them overnight. It's quite late in the evening now, so we'll come back tomorrow morning, pick up from where we left off, and we'll take this cartridge apart and see if we can manage to recover the tape. So this tape has been baking now for about 12.5 hours. It's going to have dried out quite a bit if it was damp at all, which almost certainly it would have been. It doesn't really matter where you store them, by the way, even if they're somewhere relatively dry, unless it is a temperature and humidity controlled environment, they will tend to absorb moisture. So this has been sitting here between about 53 and 55 degrees now for, as I say, about 12.5 hours. So it should be relatively dry now. So the next step is to allow this to cool down relatively slowly. Now normally I would just turn the heater off and leave it off and let this cool down. It will take about an hour and a half to cool down, but because I'm making a video, I'm going to leave this turned on. We might need to use it again if the tape's not fully dried, and I'm just going to leave this on the bench for a while upside down. It'll take about 20 minutes to cool down properly. The big metal plate on the bottom tends to retain heat. It's also why a single bottom fed heating source seems to work fairly well. And what we'll do now is leave this to cool down for a few minutes. The next thing is to take the screws out the bottom. There are 4 screws that hold the cassette together. So again, be careful when you do this. The normal tools I tend to use are tools like this, with these replaceable tips, quite useful in the workshop. Saves you having lots of different tools hanging around, but just remember that we're talking about magnetic tapes here, so using a tool like this is not a good idea with a tape. Also, a lot of tools that you might not think will be magnetic are, so I've got other screwdrivers that you wouldn't think would be magnetic, but they are. So make sure you pick one that isn't going to erase your tape. And then, as I say, next step, is to get the base off. So while this is cooling down, I'll get the 4 screws removed. They can be fairly tight, but trying to avoid stripping them. Of course, if you strip them, you've made a whole new problem for yourself. So I'll just get these removed, then we'll get back on camera, take the top off and see what condition this cassette is in. The tape's had a while to cool down, so now we'll try and get the top cover off. Don't want to bring the tape with me, so make sure everything stays behind. And we can see already that the belt on this one has actually failed. So if you can see this. So what I want to do now is try and get this off the tape without damaging the tape. Now it is on the non-media side of the tape, but even so we need to be very careful, because if we pull too hard we'll pull the tape with the belt, and that will then remove the media from the other side of the tape. So we need to be very careful. We need to try and peel it off rather than kind of pull it. So we'll get it off the pulleys to start with, and we'll get those out of the way. We'll need to clean these posts anyway, so we can get these removed. We can see the belt's broken in several places. And what I'm going to do now is very carefully try and ease this away from the tape, and if it sticks too hard, this is coming off fairly easily. If it sticks too hard, we probably need to bake it for a bit longer, but this is coming off. I don't want to turn the reel just yet, but I do want to get the drive belt out of the way. This drive belt's in several pieces, so let's get this pulley out of the way. So if you rush this part, then chances are you'll destroy the tape. And you can see it's peeling off quite easily, it's not stuck too hard. You will get this shiny spot. That's not really the media coming off the tape, that's just where it's been pressed on the smooth surface of the tape, and it's made the belt smoother over the years. So we'll get that one out of the way. Then we've got the other part to remove. Try and stop the tape from turning, and that came off quite nicely as well. So that's looking quite promising so far. The next thing we want to do is, you can see this is not actually at the beginning, it's part way through. So what I'm going to do is try very carefully turning it, and I'm going to try and turn it so we're kind of feeding the tape from the right to the left. And we're looking at this point here, so this point where the tape is leaving the reel on the right, if it starts getting pulled round, so it's stuck to the other layer of tape, we need to bake the tape for longer. It might move around a little bit, but it should free off very easily and not kind of go too far round. Or if you see it jumping, well, it'll go so far, jump, go so far and jump, and it's leaving vertical lines on the tape again. We need to bake it for longer, so we'll try and very carefully turn this. You can see it's starting to go round. It's actually not too bad. So it's separating quite nicely and easily. It's not going too far round. Really should come straight off, but there is no tension on this, so if it's just sticking a little bit, that's not going to cause any problems. And if we keep going round, if we now look at the surface of the tape, what we're trying to see, I don't know how well I can get this on the camera, is we need a nice clean, matte, even finish. If we're getting marks and lines and things, then we need to bake the tape again. So that's looking quite good. The next thing I'm going to do before I wind it any further is I'm going to take the tape off the cassette completely and clean up the guide. So I need to clean up the spindles and the pulleys themselves. We need to clean up the surface of these using some IPA, and then I'm going to clean all the spindles that they run on. So we've got one here. Sometimes there's one at the back that's worth cleaning, but that's just a guide. And then we need to clean the 2 spindles that the reels run on. We need to clean this spindle at the front, and then the 2 tape guides. So very carefully, remember we're talking here about the outside of the tape, not the media side, but again make sure you haven't got too much grease on your fingers. We need to very carefully lift off the first reel, very carefully lift off the second, and then we should be able to get this off the cassette completely. We can put that out of the way until we want to refit it. And the next thing is to clean off all the spindles and the guides. I'm just going to do it off camera. It's just really getting some IPA. Cleaning these, making sure that everything runs freely. When you put these on, they should just drop down. If they need some assistance to go down, then they need cleaning more, so it should just do that. This one's actually quite good. Quite often you'll find these are very sticky and quite hard to turn. But you need to clean the outside as well. If the tape sticks to the outside of any of these, then you'll get a problem because it will transfer that stickiness to the drive belt, then to the tape. Everything will stick together and you'll destroy the tape. So I'll get this cleaned. I've given all these spindles and the wheels a good clean, making sure they all spin nice and freely. Got rid of any residue, any dirt. Made sure that the guide posts are very clean. Made sure the mirrors are not contaminated, and make sure the door operates the way it should. And the next thing is to refit the tape, again making sure you don't have any excess grease on your fingers. So step one, we get the first reel on. It's easier to pass the tape through at this point rather than try and get it through later. You can crease the tape if you do that. And that's the first one fitted. And now onto the second one. Okay, take up the slack. And again, what we're looking for is to make sure the tape isn't being pulled too far around. If it's been pulled a long way around, what can happen is when it runs faster, it will pull the tape round, get caught under the drive belt, and it will start following the tape itself, will follow the belt around, and it will get destroyed. Next thing is to replace the drive belt. So we obviously can't use the old one anyway, but even if it was still in one piece, I wouldn't reuse it. So we refit the main drive wheel, get ourselves a new drive belt. So I use these plastic bands, and I've cleaned this with IPA. Again, these can be a bit sticky when they're new. They have a kind of release agent from when they were made, so you need to remove that with some IPA. Make sure it's dry and clean, and we can refit the drive belt, making sure we don't damage the tape. This is actually easier if the tape is driven to one end, because you can kind of hook one side of the tape underneath the cheeks on the drive pulleys, but we can't do that here because we don't want to drive the tape until we've got the belt on. So don't worry about the tape being too tight at this point. We'll tension that in a minute. Put the two rollers back on, and next thing is to get the belt on. So this is probably the only tricky bit. It's not difficult, but it's a bit more difficult like this because I can't really see what I'm doing. The camera's in the way, but hook one side round first, and then making sure the belt isn't twisted. This has got a twist in it, unfortunately, so I need to untwist that. And next thing is to get the other side of the belt on and try to stop the tape reels from turning while you're doing this. And all we need to do is pull this tight, hook it around the second of the two drive idler wheels, and then the belt should be in place. So it's quite easy to fit. It's a bit fiddly the first couple of times. Next thing we need to do is tension the tape. Now of course if we try and turn one of the reels to tension it will turn the other one as well, so we don't want to do that. Don't try and turn the tape too far when it's loose like this, because otherwise again it will get caught up in the drive belt and it will pull the tape round and damage it. So what we need to do is relieve the tension on one of the two sides so the belt isn't touching the tape. Turn the reel that we've eased the tension on until the belt is nice and tight, and then without damaging the tape, allow the tension to go back on the drive belt, and that's it. We should now find that if we slowly turn this reel, the other one will turn, and if it's very tight when you try and turn it, then something's wrong. This one doesn't feel too bad at all. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is very carefully turn this end to end. The way I normally do this is just to get a pen. You can put the pen in the pulley and then spin it round. I go fairly slow on the first pass, keep an eye on the area of interest, which is essentially this point when we're winding in this direction, or this point when we're winding it back. Make sure the tape isn't kind of clinging to itself. If it is, we put the entire tape back onto the heater, our heater system, give it another few hours, let it cool down, and then we try again. This one doesn't look too bad, so I'm going to try winding this forward, see how far I get, and assuming it goes to plan, then I'll get to the end, wind it back, and we should then be ready to put the case back together and see if we can read the tape. I'll just show the first few meters of this. So holding the tape still, making sure you haven't got your fingers on the tape itself. What I'm doing is driving this round, but it's this point here that we need to try and keep an eye on to make sure that the tape isn't misbehaving. So you can see it's turning nice and freely. The tape isn't clinging to the other layer of the tape. It's not clinging to the drive belt. Although you can't see it, I can assure you this is turning nice and freely. It's not feeling like it's stiff or binding. So what I'm going to do is go right to the end now. I'm hoping to build a test jig fairly soon to do this. This is probably the most time consuming part as far as kind of hands-on is concerned. It does take, of course, a long time to bake the tape, but you don't need to be around for that to happen. But this is quite tedious and time consuming, so I'm going to build a test jig to do this slow winding of the tape. This process will also make sure that the tape is correctly tensioned. Now, of course, the drive belt on this particular tape has been broken for a while, so we don't know if the tape has been working itself loose in that time. It's unlikely because it was fairly well stuck together, I should think, but as I say, this process will make sure that it is properly tensioned. If you try and run a loose tape at high speed, again, it will cling to the drive belt and it will destroy itself. So it's well worth taking the time to do this. It is quite tedious, but if you want to save the tape, then this is a very good step to take. So I'll get this wound to the end, wind it back to the start. I'll do that twice, and then we'll be ready to reassemble it and put it back into the machine. This tape's been putting up a bit of a fight. It was very tight trying to wind it forward. It was at the point where I was tempted to put it back on the heater, but it was freeing off relatively easily, so I decided to continue, and it was a case of winding it forward maybe 10 turns, back a couple of turns, and then every 100 turns or so popping the tape off the guide post, cleaning those. You get kind of a build-up of gunk on these two guide posts, and then repeating the process until I got to the end. I did wind it right off the end of the tape just to make sure that if I do manage to get this working, we don't encounter problems in the future if the tape does wind too far. So what you can now notice possibly is that the tape on the left hand side is fairly unevenly spooled. I don't know if that's visible on the camera or not, but normally it should be quite tightly packed, all even, and it's not. And this is the first pass. I've only wound it to the end once. So what I'll do now is wind it back. Hopefully it will turn a lot more freely than it did. It should now all be freed off, so it should turn fairly freely. So I try and wind this back the other way. It is now turning much more freely, whereas before it was going tighter and tighter with each revolution. It's now staying nice and free. So what I'll do now is wind this all the way to the beginning, see how it spools up, and then repeat the process. But it does look like it's going to free off, so if it just keeps getting stickier and stickier, then it does need to be baked again, but this tape does appear to be freeing off. Well, it's 2 days later and this tape was giving me a bit of a headache. Every time I tried to wind it from end to end, it would go so far and then the tape would start grabbing onto the two posts again. What tends to happen is, as you wind the tape round, at some point it will start to grab onto these two posts that it runs around, and then that increases the tape tension. It grabs harder and it becomes very difficult to turn the tape. If it was in the machine at that point, it would probably tear the backing off the taped, or the magnetic media, and it would stop working. That's why I wind it slowly from end to end. I'm hoping to make a test jig from an old tape drive shortly for doing that, so it can just slowly automatically run from end to end a few times and stop automatically if it gets too tight. But at the moment I'm doing it by hand, and it is quite time consuming. But what was happening with this particular tape is I'd get so far, the first time I got about a quarter of a run from end to end, and it started grabbing. So then I just put it back on the heater, bake it again for another 12 hours, try it again, and just keep going. And eventually I got to the point where it's now relatively free, and it seems to turn very freely all the way from one end to the other. It's still grabbing a little bit, but barely, and it should free up further with a bit of use if it survives. If I had a test jig, I'd bake this another couple of times and run it from end to end, but doing this manually, you have to call it quits after a certain amount of time. It's not a critical tape, this is just a demonstration one, so so far this particular tape has taken about 3 days. It's not 3 days solid work, most of the time it's just sitting there baking, but I've probably spent a good 4 hours on this tape, and it's time to put it in the machine and see what happens. So it may not read at all, it may all be a complete waste of time, but this is really the only way of finding out. So I'll get the cover screwed back on, we'll get the machine fired up and see what this tape actually does. Okay, I'll fit the tape into the machine, get it powered up first. Put the tape into the machine. I'm using the second drive here, T14 drive. Get it fitted in there. Wait for the machine to come to life. I'll turn the light off so you can see the display a bit better. Okay, and we'll see if we can read this tape. So fingers crossed, let's see what happens. And we can read the tape. So I don't know if the tape will actually work, if we can read any data from it, but it's looking good so far. And this is all showing us just data, so we'll try and load one of these and see what happens. I'm not sure what any of these are. We've got one called Lander, so we'll have a look at that. Turn the light back on so I can see the keyboard. Turn the light off. Well, it looks like it may have been successful, so let's see if we can actually list the program, and we can. Quite a long program, as you can see. So we've gone from a tape that would almost certainly have failed if we just put it in and tried to read it, to one that we at least have got one program off. We'll try and run this and see what happens. Never played this before, so I'm just guessing at what I should be entering here. Okay, so I've got no idea what I'm supposed to be doing here, but no doubt we will end up crashing into the moon. But as you can see, it's running. I won't bore you with the rest of this because I don't really know how to run this particular version of the program, but it is definitely working. So what I'm going to do now is copy this tape to another tape. I'll just move the camera back across. So as you saw, we've got the tape to at least read to a certain extent. I don't know how successful this will be, but the next thing I will do is try and copy the entire tape. It seems to be in good condition now, so I'm hoping that most of it, if not all of it, will be readable. It was struggling a little bit to read. I was taking a few attempts on some of the sectors, but they do tend to do that when they get fairly old. But with any luck I can copy the entire tape. But the point here is that you can take a tape that was otherwise just going to fail and try and recover it. Just needs a simple bit of equipment to warm it up, a bit of patience, a new drive belt, and just a bit of perseverance. And we've now got a tape that hopefully we can recover all the data from. And I've been doing this with some of the other tapes, and some are more important than others. I've got a utilities tape here that I've had similar success with. I'm just now trying to get to the point where I can get some spare tapes, blank tapes made up, and then I can start copying some of these tapes across. This is the general approach I take. As I said before, it's not necessarily the only approach, it's not necessarily the best approach, but it certainly seems to work for me, and I'm having quite a good amount of success with this. And more importantly, the tape, it's not just failing, all the backing's not peeling off as I'm trying to use it, which it would do if I just tried to put it straight in the machine. So if you find an old tape for a machine like this, don't put it in the machine to see if it works, because it probably will just destroy itself. If you go through a process like this, you can at least give it a fighting chance of being usable. So when it comes to tapes and tape images and handling data, a very good approach with a machine like the 9845 is to use a GPIB interface. And I do have a GPIB interface module for this machine. I don't know if it works yet, but the problem I've got that I need to resolve next is if I plug the in-out card into the back of this machine, it stops the tape drives from working. I just get tape drive errors, and so I've got a feeling this card has failed, or at least has some faults on it. So the next step in the next video, we'll look at this card, try and figure out what's going on and why it's stopping the tape drives from working. Most likely one of the buffers has failed, and if we can get this working, we can then move on and try and see if the HPIB interface works. But next step in the next video is to investigate this.